I think now we should start.
Okay.
Okay.
Shall I begin now?
Let me just introduce you then.
Okay.
Okay. So once again, a very good morning to all of you. And now we are here again. And this is the ongoing special lecture series, as you all know, specially designed for UG Semester 3 and Semester 5, organized by the Department of English in collaboration with IQAC KK College. And for some personal reason, our principal sir is missing today. Hope he might join us in the latter half of this series. But anyway, we should proceed.
Sure.
And let me tell you that today's speaker is already with us, and our speaker is Professor Sagnik Banerjee, Assistant Professor in English, Sundarban College. On behalf of the Department of English and KK College, I welcome him, and at the same time, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks because he gleefully accepted our proposal. So, welcome to this series of lecture, and over to you.
Thank you, Professor Bag. I will start now. I am starting my lecture. Okay. For the purpose, I think I will switch off my video and share my screen. It will be better for the bandwidth. Okay. Just a second. Okay. Today's lecture is on Spring Offensive by Wilfred Owen. Okay. Just a second. Yeah. Am I audible to everyone, please? Can everyone hear me? Is it okay? The audio? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Today's lecture I'm beginning on, it will be on Spring Offensive by Wilfred Owen. I've separated this lecture into few parts, and I begin almost chronologically, which I think would be beneficial for the students. In the introduction, I begin with perhaps one of the most important events of the early part of the 20th century, and which definitely had a very, if not the most important impact on Wilfred Owen as a poet. It's the World War from 1914 to 1918. The World War, which is known as the First World War actually, was a global event. It started from 28 July 1914 and it ended on 11th November 1918. And contemporaneously, it was described as a war to end all wars. It was there was such devastations, there was bloodshed, there was death, on a scale hitherto unimaginable. It was beyond everyone's capacity to imagine at this point of time that human lives could be so cheap. That was the very crux and essence of what the World War actually showed us. And there was a mobilization of more than 70 million personnel, including 60 million Europeans, making it one of the largest wars in history. It is also one of the deadliest conflicts in history, with an estimated 9 million combatant deaths and 13 million civilian deaths as a direct result of the war. And while the resulting genocides are related to the 1918 influenza pandemic, caused another 70 to 100 million deaths worldwide. I mean, we have now a pandemic going on, and a similar type of pandemic on a much larger devastation scale happened in 1918 with the influenza pandemic. I mean, you can imagine a world which had been 4 years in war, from 1914 to 1918, and then experience a pandemic which caused about 100 million deaths worldwide. It was absolute devastation on a grand scale. Now, what that led to was expressions on this event. Now, literatures and literary figures have always sought to experience, have sought to express their surroundings. And that has been one of the most primary effects of reasons why literature is there, is to make sense of our surroundings, make sense of where we are and what we are. And obviously the war, the First World War, being one of the most, and if not the most important event at that point of time on a human scale, it was responded by literatures, by writers, by poets who expressed their views on war, who expressed their emotions on the war, who wrote about devastation, wrote about the war through novels, through fiction, poetry, through non-fiction, essays, memoirs, in every way imaginable. Now, war poetry was one of the branches of early part of 20th century poetry, which was absolutely a reaction to the First World War. It began on that note, and it was a reaction on how the war was being portrayed. Now, before we go into what war poetry is and what is the essence of war poetry in general, let me ask you something. Now, when a war happens, when a war occurs, when there is a war, actually, we have been fortunate enough not to witness them ourselves. But when a war, it's normally the conflict, in most cases, remains outside the periphery of normal human lives, everyday lives. I mean, it doesn't happen mostly in the cities. I mean, when we're talking about the Second World War, it encompassed everything else. It also was within the cities as well. But normally, in normal sense, the battlefield are not in your particular towns, particular major cities. So what happened was that the war was already getting reported. It gets reported always. Now, people in the cities, now, who reports them? It was the newspapers, the normal way, the propaganda, the newspapers, they report the war. Now, for the people, say, for example, the people in London, when the war was being reported, it was always in the nature of, or the way the powers that be, the ruling powers, they wanted the war to be reported. And also, it was a tradition followed on from Georgian poetry, that is before the late 19th century, late 19th century, going on to the 20th century poetry, the tradition which actually saw war as being an emblem of valor, as something very valorous, something very heroic, and people who fight in wars are actually heroes. That was the tradition that was being reported. It was partly it was a literary tradition, and partly it was to induce more personnel to join the war effort. And during a war, you can understand pacifism, that is somebody who holds a position of anti-war, is not someone who is very highly sought after. I mean, we all know the history of Charlie Chaplin during the Second World War, when he was a declared pacifist, and he was kind of, I would say, restricted or kind of criticized even in his home country in England. Now, the fact that we all know is that war is reported through a lens in a normal sense. I mean, war always gets reported through a filter. We don't see the reality of war. We don't go to the trenches. We don't go to the actual battlefields. We see them. We see them in the 20th century. Nowadays, we see them on television. And in the early part of the 20th century, it was seen through the newspapers, through the radio. Now, there was a difference. There remained, in reality, a difference of what actually war was and how it was being reported and what the people knew war was. So now, in literature, when these poets came along, they sought to correct that. And by these poets, let's go into this the introduction of what actually is war poetry and how they sought to correct it. It is, as I said, set in contrast with Georgian poetry, the poetry that preceded it. While the Georgian poets presented war as a noble affair, celebrating the happy warrior proud to give life for his country, the war poets chose to represent the horror and pity of war. War is not something or to be very gleeful about. It's not something to be very proud about. It's something which the poets, it's a horror, it's horrific, it's not nice. It's not nice for so many people dying for no fault of their own. I mean, even if people are at fault, nobody should be allowed to die or be killed. War poetry is actually anti-war poetry, an indictment of the whole ideology of the nobleness of war. For war poets, war was an unnatural, meaningless, foolish, and brutal enterprise in which there is nothing honorable, glorious, or decorous. Now, I asked the students here, have any one of you come across the play Arms and the Man by George Bernard Shaw? Anyone? Yeah. Arms and the Man by George Bernard Shaw. Okay. Now, Arms and the Man, it's again a late 19th century play by the famous dramatist George Bernard Shaw, where we have a character, almost caricatured character, of Sergius, Major Sergius, who loves war, who, I mean, is an embodiment of this Georgian idea of the valor of war, that war is something very glorious. That is, if you fight in a war, you are making a country proud, and it's a very pride, it's a matter of pride to actually fight in a war. And contrasted with that was what was Bluntschli, the protagonist of the play, who can be said to be a sort of Bernard Shaw's mouthpiece, and who gave a different view of war, of practicality, of survival. Come to 20th century, the technology has improved. It's more devastation. It's more horror. And the war has become not something which is honorable anymore. It is something that was very unnatural, meaningless, and foolish. It's not within the course of nature. War is an aberration on nature. It is an obstruction of the natural flow of life. It was a kind of modern poetry which is naturalistic and painfully realistic. Now, one of the main features of war poetry is its realism, with the shocking images and language, intending to show what the war is really like. Now, these poems, by these poets like Wilfred Owen, were seeking to express what war was really like during that time. And mind you, these war poets, the primary ones, I mean, the two main ones, Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, they were both soldiers. I mean, what they were telling in their poetry, what they were writing, is not reportage. What they were writing, they had seen, they had experienced firsthand. Now, the honesty in their poetry comes from the fact that they had it's first-hand information. They have experienced the war. They are in the war. That is what gives these poems a very honest edge over the late Georgian poetry, which talks about war in a more glorious terms. They try to portray the common experience on the war, which constitutes mortality, nervous breakdown, constant fear and pressure. The war poetry is replete with the mud, the trenches, the death, the total havoc caused by war. Owen himself wrote, "Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war, the pity of war." Now, we do not realize, but one of the most, our version of war for us normal citizens, our version of war is exposed from what we have seen in television reportage and definitely in the war movies. I mean, your Hollywood as well as the Bollywood fare. But what they don't show in most cases, what we are not exposed to in most cases, is that most of the soldiers who fight in the war actually suffer from what is called a disease called PTSD, that is post-traumatic stress disorder. They suffer mental illnesses because of seeing so much pressure, being under so much pressure of life. I mean, imagine 24 hours you're living every day in a trench, in mud, without food, mostly without water, and every second, every minute, every hour, you are afraid that you will be killed. Your life is at risk, every second. And this happens for years. I mean, it's unthinkable. Now, this is the war that Owen talks about. This is the subject of Owen's poetry. I move on to the next slide. War poetry encompasses the poetry written during and about the First World War. That was what I was talking about. The felt reality of this body, which was set against the abstract language of heroism, became the ground of protest. Now, war poetry is actually a change in direction in poetic history. It's a ground of protest. Georgian poetry, the poetry and the narratives which actually valorize war, which sought war to be something very great for the nation, for the benefit of the nation, for the progress of the nation, these people protested against that expression. These people went against that expression and created a reality of war. In fact, hundreds of war poets wrote and published their verse between 1914 and 1918, and some of them were soldiers, poets who died on the war front. Catherine Riley's 1978 Bibliography of English Poetry of the First World War lists over 3,000 works by 2,225 poets. I mean, there were actually well over 2,000 poets who were writing about war. The term war poetry can be applied primarily, or the main people are Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, and Siegfried Sassoon, amongst others. So here you have pictures of Rupert Brooke and Siegfried Sassoon. Now we come to the third and perhaps the most important member of this triumvirate is Wilfred Owen, the man we are going to study today and look into today. Owen was born in Oswestry on the Welsh borders and was brought up in Birkenhead in Shrewsbury, is widely recognized as one of the greatest voices of First World War during his lifetime. But he's virtually unknown. Only 4 of his poems were published during his lifetime. But he had always been determined to be a poet and had experimented with verse from an early age. In 1913 to 1915, whilst teaching at Bordeaux and Banerjee de Bigorre in France, he worked on the rhyming patterns which became characteristic of his poetry, but it was not until the summer of 1917 that he found his true voice. Here you can see Wilfred Owen in his uniform. In 1915, Owen enlisted in the British Army. His first experience of active service at Serre and Saint-Quentin in January and April 1917 led to shell shock and his return to Britain. Shell shock means, we use a word in English as well, being shell shocked. It actually came from the war that when a shell or a bomb falls near you, the sound and the trauma is so huge, people go into often a shock, a mental state of a trauma, a shock and static sense, nature, which you need medical attention, constant medical attention to get out of. And Owen returned to Britain after that shell attack. Whilst he was undergoing treatment at Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, in Scotland, he returned to Britain and he was undergoing treatment in Scotland. He met one of his literary heroes, Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon too was there, who provided him with the guidance and the encouragement to bring his war experiences into his poetry. So it was Sassoon actually who influenced Wilfred Owen to write about his experiences through his poetry. When Owen returned to the Western Front, after more than a year away, he took part in the breaking of the Hindenburg Line at Joncourt, for which was awarded the Military Cross in recognition of his courage and leadership. Now, as an aside, the Hindenburg Line was actually the front line, the border line between the Axis powers and the Allied powers, the Germany and Britain at that point of time, the British powers and Germany, which was the Hindenburg Line. It was named after von Hindenburg, who went on to become Germany's president after the war. And he was awarded or as Military Cross as recognition of his courage and leadership, Wilfred Owen. Owen was killed on 4th November 1918 during the battle to cross the Sambre-Aux Canal at Ors exactly 1 week. Now, this is in France, almost to the hour before the signing of the armistice which ended the war. Exactly, almost to the hour, exactly just 1 week prior to the ending of the First World War, Wilfred Owen was killed in an attack. He was promoted to the rank of lieutenant the day after his death. His mother received the telegram informing her of his death on Armistice Day. That is 1 week after her son's death, the mother just receives a telegram. Now you can imagine the emotional aspect of it. A mother whose son has died in the war just receives the information that the son is dead. A mother who perhaps for the last 2.5 years has not seen her son, just through letters knew that he is alive. And suddenly the letters stop. One official letter arrives that your son is dead and he has died in war. The mother doesn't even get to receive the corpse of the son. In most cases, because the corpse are so dismembered and mangled, they cannot be transported. And you can see Wilfred Owen being buried in France. This is his grave. And he's buried at the Ors Communal Cemetery in northern France. The inscription on his gravestone, chosen by his mother Susan, is based on a quote from his poetry. Shall life renew these bodies? Of a truth death will ye annul. I move on to the next slide. Wilfred Owen's draft preface. Now, Owen, this draft preface is prepared for a collection of war poems that he hoped to publish in 1919. Obviously, Owen did not publish, could not publish his collection of war poems because he died before that. And it was written in Ripon in Yorkshire in 1918. Now, this gives a very fitting insight into what Owen was trying to do, what his ethos was. And I think it's very essential to actually get into the mind of the author, mind of the poet, to actually understand what he was trying to say. Owen says, this book is not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them. Nor is it about deeds or lands or anything about glory, honor, might, majesty, dominion, or power, except war. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. This is what I said before. Yet these elegies, now he crafts this poem as elegies, are to this generation in no sense consolatory. They may be to the next. All a poet can do today is warn. That is why the true poets must be truthful. If I thought the letter of this book would last, I might have used proper names, but if the spirit of it survives Prussia, my ambition and those names will have achieved fresher fields than Flanders. Now, let me explain what he's trying to say. Now, very categorically, he goes on to say, this book is not about heroes. English poetry is not fit for them. True heroes. He distinctly signifies that people who fight in war or people who are about war are not heroes. English poetry is not fit for them. It is nor is it about deeds, lands, anything about glory, honor, might, majesty, dominion, or power, except war. It is not about glory. He starts, now look at very clearly, he starts about his text or the preface by telling us what this book is not about. It's not about heroes. It's not about deeds. It is not about lands. It is not about anything about glory, honor, might, majesty, or like that. Then what it is about? It is about the war, the pity of war. Now, this word he highlights pretty much many a times, that is the pity. Now, what do you mean by pity? Can anyone say to me? What does pity mean? Anyone? What is the meaning of pity? No one?
Hello, sir.
Hello? Yeah.
Sir, I'm saying directly to you, okay?
Yes, sure. Please go on.
Okay. I think, sir, here pity means to feel sorry for the sufferings that the soldiers have endured, the prisoners have had to bear. I think this is mostly about what you mean by pity.
Yes, absolutely. It's a pity, no, definitely about the soldiers, pity about what they've endured. But not only that, it's feeling sorry. It's not feeling sorrow about what actually the world has lost. Owen, if you just, not just his Spring Offensive, but if you look at the other poems, or the famous poems of Wilfred Owen, one common theme that you would come across in all of his poetry is that war is a loss. It's a loss of human lives, and most importantly, it's a loss of potential. It's a loss of potential of the human race. Owen speaks about that. Now, why does he talk about the loss of potential of the human race? Because most of the soldiers who died, most of the front men who died in the war were young boys, young people, boys and girls, young people, the soldiers who were there. Now, the civilians who died, they were, what I might say, they were the sort of passive victims of war. They did not take part in it. They were forced, the war was forced upon them. The soldiers were forced to take part in it. I mean, you can understand 18, 19, 20 years of age, 21 years of age. Many of them, almost all of them, these young kids perishes. People, most of them your age or just about 1 or 2 years older. These people perished in the war. Now, this is a loss of potential for the human race. I mean, just think about what the world could have achieved had these people been alive. I mean, it might have been possible that some of these young people who died in the war could have gone on and made scientific discoveries, maybe have cured cancer, been a scientist in the future. But the war took that person away from. We never know. We could never know. Now, this is what we call a standing or a recurring motive in Wilfred Owen's poetry is the pity and the pity of the loss of potential. Yes, it is a loss of there is a loss of life. There are loss of soldiers' lives, loss of civilian lives. But above all, it's a future that is lost. For a generation, for 1 or 2 generations, the future is lost. Parents losing their children. Owen himself, Owen's mother himself suffered that. Parents losing their children, parents writing epitaphs for their child's grave. That is unthinkable as a pain. And not just as being sorry for the pain, but you can understand. I mean, just take Wilfred Owen, for example. He lived for a few years. I mean, he was born in 1893, died in 1918, mid-20s. And he wrote some immensely brilliant poetry. Now, what if he had been alive? He never could see his poems being published during his lifetime. Think about the sorrow or the pity that the person wrote this preface, hoping to publish his work, his creation. But he could not see the light of day. The pity lies in the fact that war is a destruction which clouds creation. The poetry is an emblem of creation, but war is destruction that absolutely takes over creation. This is the loss of potential that Owen speaks about through his poetry. It's a pity, being sorrowful for the life's loss, yes, definitely, but also mostly being sorrowful for the potential lost, for the future that is lost. Yet these elegies are to this generation in no sense consolatory. Owen is very clear that through his poems he's not trying to console the people, the generation. And when you read the poem, you will see that his words, his diction is not consolatory at all. His tone is not consolatory. He's trying to hammer home the truth of war. And that is what he says. They may be to the next. All a poet can do today is warn. That is why true poets must be truthful. True poets must always adhere to the truth. That is what he says. Because all a poet can do today is warn. Warn of the atrocities of war. Warn of the devastation of war. Warn of the reality of war. He wanted his poems to be taken as a warning. Don't glorify war. It's nothing glorious. It's unthinkable. It's unnatural. It's meaningless. People are dying for no reason at all. Human life has become very cheap. That is what Owen wants to portray. And that is the truth that he wishes to chase. Now, in hindsight, we all know, did the world take Owen's warning? He wanted to warn the people of war in 1917. Did the world actually heed his warning? The answer is no, because almost 30 years later, we had another world war, the Second World War, which was even more devastating. We move on to the next slide. Here we talk about Owen, the war poet. Wilfred Owen would not have written the war poems for which he is now famous if he had not met Secret Sassoon in August 1917. And we all know, we have discussed how Sassoon was a very influential figure in Owen's life. Until then, like the vast majority of British people, Owen believed that war was being fought for a just cause. Now, here you can imagine, now, this is very important, because prior to Siegfried Sassoon's prior to him meeting Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, of all people, too believed that war was good. It was fought for a just cause. It was necessary. It was necessary for the safety and the glory of the nation. It was necessary for to further a very important cause. That is, prior to meeting Siegfried Sassoon, Owen had a philosophical position which is absolutely opposite to what he has written in poetry. It was Sassoon who talked to pacifists, Bertrand Russell among them, saw things differently. He thought politicians had secretly changed their aims and were now more interested in grabbing colonies and trade. The truth of war is never spoken to the media. The truth of war is never spoken to the soldiers. Sassoon, who understood that it was not about the glory and the safety and the furthering of your nation. It was all about the politicians' greed. It was all about the greed of exploiting the colonies, exploiting the trade. It was a war fought over the trade and who will benefit most from the trade market. Now, you know, 1917 was a time when there was colonization all over the world. And it was a hold over these colonists. Now, imagine if Britain had lost the First World War. Germany had won it. I mean, we perhaps could have become a German colony instead of a British colony from 1917 on, 1918 onwards. We could have. Now, it was colonies and trade which actually facilitated the war. That Sassoon understood, and he influenced Wilfred Owen. Owen saw the reality, and Owen was taught the other reality, the true reality of the meaningless, the futility, that war was fought for personal gains. The people at power, for their personal gains, were actually throwing people, young children, young kids, 19, 20, 21 years of age, to die in the battlefield so that their coffers, their bank balances can improve. Sassoon was writing furious poems of protest aimed at the civilian conscience, hoping to persuade the public of the need for immediate peace negotiations. Now, war actually is facilitated by public support. The public want war. And Sassoon was writing poems to make the public realize, as a form of reverse propaganda, make the public realize about the truth of war and the meaninglessness of war. And this actually influenced Wilfred Owen very much. Owen had been writing verse for at least 6 years and had learned to use sound effects with some skill, but until he met Sassoon, he lacked a subject that could feel strongly about. Believing, like Wordsworth, that poetry arises from emotion recollected in tranquility, he sent his mind back to the experiences he had undergone at and near the front earlier in 1917. His earliest poems to show Sassoon's influence was the first version of the Deadbeat, Anthem for Doomed Youth, Dulce Decorum Est, and The Disabled. So this was his on the first earliest and most famous war poems that Wilfred Owen wrote. From November 1917, Owen began to find other models. Robert Graves urged him to have a spirit above wars, advice that helped him to produce Apologia pro Poemate Meo, in defense of my poetry. Now, Robert Graves was an apologist for the war. He favored war, and since Owen was writing anti-war poems, Robert Graves wrote him an open letter that he wanted Owen to show a spirit above war, to support the government. Now, this is the common theme we have even today. I mean, you will always find people to tell you to support the country even if what the country is doing is wrong. It's not truthful. Owen was speaking the truth. Robert Graves told him to have a spirit above wars. I mean, Robert Graves basically told him that why do you hate the war so much? Don't have a spirit or write something about something else. Look beyond the war. Don't always write about wars. War, what is it? It's something very necessary, it's something very good that our country is doing. It's for the benefit of the country. And why are you criticizing it? As a retort to that, Owen wrote Apologia pro poemati meo, means in defense of my poetry. He wrote another remarkable piece that admits to the exaltation of battle, yet condemns pitiless civilians. Protest was not enough. The supreme value now was the pity of war, as Shelley had said. The pity enabled people to enter imaginatively into the suffering of others. What Owen achieved as a poet, and what the poet achieved, is to let the readers enter into the scene. Now, you don't get the feeling, don't get that emotional quotient in reportage, because reportage, you always read it from a third-person perspective. When you are reading a report about a war, you are always thinking, okay, it has happened somewhere else, it will never happen to me. So you don't associate yourself with that. You don't feel about that much more. But this is where literature is very essential. And when you are writing a poem about a war, when you are writing about the experiences of war very directly, it's a poet's language and it's a poet's diction which makes you go right into the battlefield, right into the heart, right into the emotion, and you feel for that, which is much more stronger. The huge German offensive on 21st March 1918 showed that Germany was still intent on military victory. Owen's response was to write some of his greatest poems, including Futility, The Send-Off, Mental Cases, and Mental Cases. Strange Meeting is perhaps the only wartime poem in which a soldier meets the man he has killed and hears the truth from his enemy, who is now, too late, his friend. Now, I would suggest everyone to also read, apart from Spring Offensive, the poem Strange Meeting. Here, two soldiers meet when actually one of them has died, and they converse. And they realize that both of them are actually not very much different than each other. I mean, the emotions, the insecurities of a soldier on one side of the fence is actually the same on the soldier the other side of the fence. Both of them are actually friends in a way, and that is what the dead soldier speaks, that it's too late now, my friend. Yeah, I've been killed. Spring Offensive, thought by many to be Owen's finest poem, was begun in the summer and perhaps completed at the front in early October. The final lines, the last he ever wrote, may have been added after he has seen and tried to help dozens of men killed and wounded on the Hindenburg line. And the final lines of Spring Offensive is perhaps the final lines ever written by Wilfred Owen in his life. So before we move on to on the right in the image, you can see the manuscript, the draft of Dulce Decorum Est. It is written in Owen's own handwriting. There's a picture of that. Now, we discuss next the important themes of Owen's poetry. What can we see? Owen, so personally familiar with the experience of war, captures in his poems the tragedy of war. Most of his poems allude to the loss of innocence that is concomitant of war. We have discussed that. Owen's poems also depict the deep bond of friendship and understanding that developed between the soldiers. He makes his reader confront the atrocities on the battlefield and the indignities of life back home. He presents before his readers soldiers who have lost their limbs and been victims of poison gas, young men mourning their dead, comrades, ghastly battlefields, dreamscapes, a cacophony of sounds terrifying in their unceasing monotony and nature's wrath. There is little glory and heroism about them, just scared or desensitized youth men fighting for a cause they do not quite understand. His poems expose his view that war is absurd and incomprehensible. The battles depicted in the poems are unconnected to each other, existing in a vacuum with seemingly no larger purpose. War is something without any purpose. That is perhaps the recurring theme of Wilfred Owen's poetry. Apart from that, Owen is sympathetic to the ways in which soldiers attempted to make sense of their peculiar and terrible situation on the front and back at home. He understands that many want to deaden and dull themselves to the thoughts and feelings in order to starve off the anguish over what they have done and seen. They are drained of vitality, able to laugh in the face of death. Now, what Owen sees and is sympathetic, he's pitiful for the way in human emotion is deadened in the soldiers, so that they can survive, or people intentionally doing them. Nature is a very strong theme of Owen's poems. Nature as an antithetical to the world, which you'll find in large abundance in Spring Offensive. A very strong image in Spring Offensive is nature coming as an antithesis to war, to show that war is unnatural. Nature is, as a force, is life-giving. War as a force is life-taking. Thus, when fighting breaks out, nature also reflects the turmoil. In Spring Offensive, most memorably, when fighting begins, the whole sky burned with fury against them. Now, this is purely Shakespearean. I mean, we know when in Shakespeare, in Julius Caesar, in Macbeth, when anything bad happens, when Macbeth was trying to kill King Duncan, or when Julius Caesar was being murdered, the night before, there was reminiscences in nature. Nature revolted. Similarly here, when the fighting begins as something unnatural, the whole sky burned with fury against them. Nature can no longer save this man. The third section, we come now directly to the poem. Spring Offensive was is a recording, or is a mention of the attack on St. Quentin by the 2nd Battalion of Manchester Regiment in April 1917. Now, this is actually the place which Owen is describing. This is a place where it's St. Quentin, where Spring Offensive, the battle actually was fought. There's a modern picture, but it was a bit different in 1917. The attack by the 2nd Manchesters was in support of the French to attempt to capture the strongly held city of St. Quentin. The battalion's objective was a German trench on some high ground north of the city called Dancourt Trench. Lieutenant Colonel Luxmore, the Manchester's commanding officer, a very experienced officer who had been active service since the Battle of Mons in August 1914, quickly realized that merely to reach the start line for the attack would involve his men coming under very severe artillery fire. In July 1918, when Owen was in Scarborough, Owen wrote Spring Offensive, much of which can be related to the surroundings of the events of April 1917, attack on Dancourt Trench. Lines 1 to 4 and lines 27 to 46 of the poem can be said perhaps to relate to the battalion's experiences at Squash Valley and descent under fire through Figwood to the assembly area. Now you can understand the Figwood, you can see here in Squash Valley, the places, and they are directly related in the poem. Now we begin Wilfred Owen's Spring Offensive, the text. It's separated, structurally the poem is separated in 6 different stanzas, and 6 different stanzas reflect 6 phases of the offensive. Stanza 1 is the setting of the scene. Stanza 2 is the pause before the attack. The 3rd stanza builds up the tension. The 4th is the attack. The 5th are the casualties. And the 6th focus on the survivors. So 6 different stanzas structurally are focusing on 6 different parts or 6 different stages of the offensive. Now let us begin. Halted against the shade of a last hill, they fed, and lying easy were at ease, and finding comfortable chests and knees, carelessly slept. But many there stood still to face the stark, blank sky beyond the ridge. Knowing their feet had come to the end of the world, marveling they stood and watched the long grass swirled by the May breeze. Murmurous with wasp and midge, for though the summer oozed into their veins, like the injected drug for their bones' pains. Sharp on their souls hung the imminent line of grass, fearfully flashed the sky's mysterious glass. The soldiers, the image, what you get is that, look at the first line, halted against the shade of a last hill. Look at the words used, last hill. It's almost metaphorical that this is the last hill they're going to experience in their life. It's geographical as well as metaphorical. It's the last hill they're resting, the soldiers. They fed, they had food, and lying easy were at ease. Now they were waiting, they were resting, they were at ease. It's a military position. When you have attention and then they can be at ease. And finding comfortable chests and knees, carelessly slept. Now imagine 18, 19-year kids who have not slept maybe for 7 days or 8 days, continuously being worried any moment they can be killed. Now when they have a moment to rest, they just fall asleep. But many there stood still to face the stark blank sky beyond the ridge. To many, the fear was still there. That is, beyond the ridge, beyond what they can see, lies something which might kill them. Their lives would be gone. They have to go there. They were fearful. It's a fear that they're facing. And the tension that they're facing. Knowing their feet had come to the end of the world. They know that their feet had come to the end of the world. Now look at, again, the phrase used here. First line, there is last hill. Now, there is end of the world. End of the world. Clearly, Owen is signifying that these soldiers have come to the end of their lives almost. Now, every soldier, before he goes to battle, before he goes to the front, doesn't know if he would come back alive, or maybe in a coffin. Every battle for every soldier it's very easy for us sitting at home, very easy for us being away from the front line to actually think about war as being something very glorious, something very glamorous, because that's what our films have taught us. But it's not. Every time a soldier goes in the front line, deep within his heart, he feels, even for a fleeting moment, that this might be my last. I might not return. I might die. And consider a world war when there was death in such a huge scale. This was what was the primary thought in the soldier's mind. The last hill, the end of the world. Marveling they stood. Now, this second part of the first stanza, I think, is almost Keatsian in its imagery. The fear of the first part of the first stanza, the first 6 lines, the fear of the soldiers, the blankness, the fact that these soldiers are devoid of any vitality, devoid of any life. The moment they get, they are at ease and they get a moment to rest, they just fall asleep. They are so tired in life. Compared to that, the second part of the first stanza actually focuses on the abundance of life in nature, and the overflowing of vitality in almost Keatsian way. Marveling they stood and watched the long grass world. Now you look at the nature imagery. The long grass world by the May breeze, murmurs with wasp and midge. For though the summer oozed into their veins, now look at the word ooze, summer oozed into their veins. The vitality of summer, it's actually they oozed into their veins like the injected drug for their bones pains. Sharp on their souls hung the imminent line of grass. Fearfully flashed the sky's mysterious glass. Though there was the wasp, the mage, the grass, the summer nature actually was like an injected drug for their bones pains. It acted like a soothing balm. But still, sharp on their souls hung the imminent line of grass. They were still focused on the last line of grass. They could not experience the beauty of nature. They were focused on the last line of grass. Fearfully flashed the sky's mysterious glass. Means the last line of the grass is growing on their own conscience, is growing on their mind. And the soul grows sharp when the healing stops, and the nature here also kind of gives them an awareness that beyond this is possible death. That last line is reminiscent of a possible death beyond that. Hour after hour, they ponder the warm field and the far valley behind, where the buttercup had blessed the gold with the slow boots coming up, where even the little brambles would not yield, but clutched and clung to them like sorrowing hands. They breathed like trees unstirred. Hour after hour, they pondered the warm field. For hour after hour, they were lying, they were waiting in the field, warm field, and the far valley was behind, where the buttercups had blessed with gold, their slow boots coming up. Means the buttercups, the flowers, it's actually kind of when they were walking through the fields, the flowers brushed their boots, and pollen stuck on the golden pollen stuck on their boots. It's as if their boots have become golden by the blessing of the flowers. And the little brambles would not yield, but clutched and clung to them like sorrowing hands. They breathed like trees unstirred. When they're walking through the fields, the little brambles, it's like as if they were holding on. They stuck onto their clothes, their boots. It's as if the poet imagines the little bushes, the shrubs were holding on to these soldiers, almost pleading them not to go, pleading them not to end their lives, pleading them not to go into this unnatural act of killing. Nature is not about killing. Nature is about giving life. Nature is about life. The world is about life. And it's almost like sorrowing hands. They're pleading these young kids, don't end your life, don't go. But these soldiers, they breathe like trees unstirred. They are unmoved. They don't feel anything. They are young people full of life, vitality, have been conditioned into robots, have been conditioned into mere killing machines. It's kill or be killed. And for what? For whom? What benefit does it bring? This is the question Owen brings very, very many a times, almost all through his poems. Now, this stanza, the second stanza, it gives more of a pastoral feeling, an idyllic nature. It's a pause before the attack. And the soldiers, actually, they represent the separation between the communion between man and nature. Now you see the buttercups are crangling onto their boots. The brambles are holding them back, but yet they remain unstirred. Owen reflects somewhere mankind has deviated from its natural course. Nature is trying to hold back man, but man is not relenting. Man will go on. And to quote Shakespeare's words, the primrose way to the everlasting bonfire, to death. He will go on. He is going on. The next stanza focuses on the tension. Till like a cold gust thrilled the little word, at which each body and its soul begirt, and tightened them for battle. No alarms of bugles, no high flags, no clamorous haste, only a lift and flare of eyes that face the sun like a friend with whom their love is done. O larger shone that smile against the sun, mightier than whose beauty these have spurned. Till that cold gust thrilled the little word, at which each body its soul begirt. What is the little word? It might be attention, it might be attack. That little word, that direction, that little word that was shouted by the command that was given, it kind of thrilled them that with a cold wind. যেটা বলা হয় একটা ঠান্ডা বাতাস শরীরের মধ্যে দিয়ে চলে যায়. A cold gust of wind actually flowed within their body, at which each body and its soul begirt and tightened them for battle. Their restlessness, they were resting. The resting position has now turned to a restless position. But Owen focuses on no alarms of bugles, no high flags, no clamorous haste, only a lift and flare of the eyes that faced. Again, Owen is signifying that the war is not glorious. There are no bugles, there are no high flags, there is no sound, there is no announcement that these young people are going into battle. No clamorous haste, only a lift and flare of the eyes that face the sun. It's something there is no glorious effort involved here. It's just they looked at the sun like a friend with whom their love is done. Look at the lines, with whom their love is done. Again, the image of death is coming into it. They are going beyond, they're putting nature behind, they're leaving one by one the fields, they're leaving the fields behind, they're leaving the buttercups behind, they're leaving the brambles which held them back behind, they're leaving the wasp, the midge, the sun too behind. Every symbol of life, the sun is a symbol of life. The sun gives life on the planet. But these soldiers are embracing death and they're leaving the sun behind. O larger shone that smile against the sun, mightier than whose bounty these have spurned. The smiles of the soldiers almost shone larger than the sun, mightier than whose bounties these have spurned. The soldiers have been so deadened in emotion, they can now smile at the face of certain death. Their smiles are mightier than the sun itself. That's what, whose bounty, and they have spurned. Spurned means bounty they have refused, the life they have refused. The next stanza is the attack, the actual representation of the attack. So soon they topped the hill and raced together over an open stretch of herb and heather, exposed. And instantly the whole sky burned with fury against them, and soft sudden cups opened in thousands for their blood, and the green slopes chasmed and steepened sheer to infinite space. Now, so soon as, just as they topped the hill and raced together, I have a question here. Okay, I'll come. I have a question here. Okay, I'll come with to the question after I complete the class. Okay. So soon they topped the hill and raced together over, over an open stretch of herb and heather exposed, and instantly the whole sky burned with fury against them. And soft sudden cups opened in thousands for their blood, and the green slopes chasmed and steepened sheer to infinite space. Just as they topped the hill and raced together over an open stretch of herb and heather. Now you see again images of nature is here given here as well. And they remain exposed to artillery fire. And instantly the whole sky burned with fury against them. The moment these soldiers crossed the hill and went into the battle, the line of fire, the whole sky burned with fury against them. Now, this whole sky burning with fury against them is a metaphor for, on one hand, they spurning nature's bounties, they spurning nature, and now nature has could not even save them. Nature has kind of given up. It's beyond nature. And also it signifies the fire, the fire of fire and fury of the artilleries of the opposition, of the war. And so as they were running down the slope, charging down the slope, soft sudden cups opened in thousands for their blood. Now this signifies the landmines, the mines which were the shell craters. It's soft sudden cups opened in thousands for their blood. Now this image, the sudden cups opened in thousands for their blood, it's an inversion of religious image. Now we all know the image of the Holy Grail, which actually held the blood of Christ after his crucifixion. Now these cups are shell craters. Now as the soldiers were running down the slope, the shell craters, the shells exploded, the mines and the shells exploded and created almost cups in the soil, which were filled with the blood of these soldiers. Their bodies were blown to bits and they were filled with the blood of these soldiers. So it's not a blood of salvation. When Christ was crucified and his blood was held in the Holy Grail, it was the blood of salvation of mankind. This is not a blood of salvation of mankind. This is a blood of something else. This is a blood of meaninglessness. There is a loss of life, of meaninglessness. There is no salvation beyond this. Owen is very critically clear that beyond this, there is absolutely no salvation. It's meaninglessness. Chasmed and steepened sheer to infinite space. It's chasm means the holes, and steepened sheer to infinite space. It's infinite space perhaps resembles eternity, resembled the death, resembled extinction of these lives. And it's sort of kind of hell's upsurge, or that which we come across in the next stanza. It's kind of hell opening up. The next stanza, they talk about the casualties of war, and the final stanza is about the survivors. Of them who running on that last high place left to swift unseen bullets, or went up on the hot blast and fury of hell's upsurge, or plunged and fell away past the world's verge, some say God caught them even before they fell. Of them who running on that last high place, left to swift unseen bullets or went up on a hot blast. It's a clear depiction of the war. Some left to swift unseen bullets. They don't know where the bullets are coming from. They are coming from all directions. The bullets were unseen. Some leapt, some were thrown off their feet when bullets struck them. On the hot blast of fury of hell's upsurge, means when the mine blast under their feet, or plunged and fell away past this world's verge, means plunged and fell away into death, in this world's end, beyond this world's end. Some say God caught them even before they fell. This stanza, the last line of the stanza, is perhaps the most problematic here in the sense, because it can carry a different meaning. Some say, the very word some say, the very expression some say, means Owen is not sure about it, and Owen wants us to believe that it is not sure. I mean, this entire narrative of salvation, Owen is kind of turning it on its head. Now, this entire narrative that when you die in a war, or when you're killed in a war, when you die in a battlefield for your country, you are so exalted and that you go to heaven, and that you are dying a noble death. Now, this is the narrative Owen is critiquing in this last line. Some say means some people say that it is true, but believe me, actually it is not. Some say God caught them even before they fell. Some say they died a valiant and a noble death. The death was a just. Their death was something for a just cause. They achieved through something very noble through their death. Some say that. It's kind of a typical way of saying, "Ha, kyo bole." But when we talk about like that, something as kyo bole, ha ora bole chilo, it kind of implies that we don't believe in that. Owen implies the same thing, and he says it's a wry expression. Some say God caught them before they fell, but actually did not. God did not catch them before they fell. It was not a noble death at all. Being blown to bits is definitely not a noble death at all. But what say such as from existence brink? Ventured but brave too swift to think, the few who rushed in body to enter hell, and there outfiending all its fiends and flames with superhuman inhumanities. Now, this expression is very interesting here. He compares the soldiers who rushed in body to enter hell. He compares a battlefield to hell, which we can understand. And he compares the soldiers as somebody, or as people who rushed to enter hell, and they are outfiending all its fiends. And the hell is full of demons and devils. And the devilish nature of war is such that even the devils of hell are being out-deviled, to be precise. They're out-fiended, all its fiends, and flames with superhuman inhumanities. Inhumanities of superhuman proportions. Long famous glories, immemorial shames, and crawling slowly back have by degrees regained cool, peaceful air in wonder. Why speak they not of comrades that went under? Now, this final stanza kind of it talks about that this soldiers talks about these wars. The people talk about long famous glories and immemorial shames. It's an action and that yields both. And crawling slowly back, it reminds us of those who creep back silent in the poem Sent Off. The cool, peaceful air of the healing water in the poem Village Wells. Nature once more restorative of bruised bodies and minds. See, crawling slowly back have by degrees regained cool, peaceful air in wonder. Slowly, when war will be finished, when war is complete, nature is restorative. Nature will again kind of recapture. Nature will again soothe and heal mankind with all its glory. But Owen asks a question in the end, and when people have regained cool, peaceful air in wonder, why speak they not of comrades that went under? Means why speak they not of people who died? It is the pity of, perhaps it is the pity of war. The pity of war distilled is too concentrated in emotion to bear discussion or even rational thought. There seems to be troubling issues here that are unresolved and unresolvable. And in the end, he asked about the death, the devastation, and why they are silent. And it's Owen's own job. He takes it upon himself to speak of those comrades who went under. Because those comrades who have died, they are silent. They cannot speak. But in the end, he almost ends with a rhetorical question that why speak they not of comrades that went under? Means the world does not speak of the comrades who went under. Ultimately, in the world, the fallen soldiers, the millions of fallen soldiers, they will all but remain forgotten, a footnote in history, as numbers. I mean, we all know now, even when I was beginning the class, we all talked about the millions of people, the 5 million, 6 million, 10 million people who died, the 7 million soldiers who were killed. Numbers, not individual people. Individual people reduced just to numbers. 7 million people killed or 7 million soldiers killed amounts to 7 million families who have lost their child. Amounts to 7 million parents who have lost their future, their child. Amounts to 7 million futures lost. Amounts to about well over 7 million parents who have grieved all their life. We don't know that. We cannot speak about that. They remain in history, a footnote in history. With that, the poem ends, and after that, we talk about, before we take the questions, we just kind of very slowly, shortly discuss the symbolism that is there in the poem. Nature symbolism of spring, summer, symbolizing life that we've talked about, is a key motive in the course of the poem, which is overturned with the horrors of war, with its emblems of blood and bombs. There are religious symbols provided by the words blessings bestowed by the buttercup and the chalice, the receptacles which I was talking about, that holds the blood of these soldiers, the craters, the images of heaven and hell, and eyes are very significant symbols here. Their sight, they are seeing the last line, and it's through their eyes that they're making sense of the fear that is around. We can make sense of the fear that they have there, that is there within them. And eventually silence is the most powerful one, the symbol of silence, kept by the few who are left. The people who survived, they are so terrified. The war has left such a lasting memory that silence is their only recourse. Silence is their only refuge. We also see the image of camaraderie, the friendship within the soldiers. They are all there in this together. And obviously the theme of war as hell. And belief in war is a belief against God. Belief in war is a belief, it's a loss of faith. And that is one of the major concern of Owen, who acknowledges that there are someone who believe that the dead are blessed. Somewhere in the society at that point of time, war was having a religious support from the religious community. And people believe that who died in war actually were blessed. However, the larger question is that those who survive think, what those who survive think and feel, and why they seem unable to comfort themselves with similar truths. That is, those who survived the war, who have seen from first hand, though they think differently, they cannot conform to the idea that those who died were blessed. Okay, and this is about it. And the next two themes we have are silence, which we are talking about, and obviously the theme of heroism, which is to Owen is ambivalent, and which Sassoon rejected, is understated but present. The theme of long famous glories resulting from the bravery of this man is balanced by the immemorial shames. Owen, on the other hand, whereas Siegfried Sassoon directly said there is no heroism in war, for Owen, the fact that these young people were challenging almost death, courting death, is a heroism on their personal front, not as a collective soldiers, but on their personal front. But their act of soldiership for a meaningless cause, this very structure which pushes them there, is something which is filled by immemorial shames, which is also there forever. There is a theme of guilt in the poem, as with many others. However, it is a pity of war which runs through every aspect of Spring Offensive. In Owen's last completed poem, the final irony may be that pity is too deep to be spoken. That is why nobody speaks of the comrades that went under. Okay, thank you. I'll take the questions now. Any questions you have? I have one, Amitabh Banerjee, who written, if I'm correct, Wilfred Owen had served as an ambulance driver in the intervening years during the First World War, which made him associate himself with the victims, prisoners, and casualties of war. Am I right, sir? Well, Amitabh, this part of history I'm not yet aware of. I'll have to look up whether he was an ambulance driver. From what I know is that he was enlisted in 1915. What I said also, he was enlisted in 1915, and he fought 2 years in the front. He died he was promoted to the rank of a lieutenant. He was in the front from 17 to 1918, about few months. He was in the hospital in Edinburgh as he suffered from shell shock on the front. And from 18, he was also killed in the front. What his experiences of war are, he actually saw the trenches, he actually saw the casualties in the front line. Whether he was an ambulance driver sometime in between in the intervening years within the war, I am not exactly aware of. We shall have to look at, and if you can get back to me, I'll just look at it and inform you. Okay, any more questions? Any questions on the class?
Sir?
Yes, please.
Sir?
Please go on.
Can you please tell me who was the author of Do Not Coach Angel into the Good Night?
It was Dylan Thomas.
Dylan Thomas.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I'm giving my email address here. If anybody has any questions, I'll also, if you want, I can share this PowerPoint with you. If it is possible, I can mail it to Professor Bagh. If it's possible, sir, we can share it with the students or somewhere on your platform.
It can be shared. It can be shared using Google Classroom.
Okay, okay. Then I'll be.
You can also share this.
Okay. I have a question here where the soldiers are afraid of death and at the same time it's a job to kill others. Then what does death actually signify? Very interesting question. Yes, they were afraid of death, definitely, as all human beings are. We are afraid of death. And at the same time, yes, it's a job to kill others. In the war, death, what does death actually signify? Death actually, it's meaninglessness. That is what it signifies within the ambit what Owen is talking about. It signifies the meaninglessness of pursuit. See, on the one hand, it's a natural inclination. People are afraid to die. If I know for sure that if I go out or go to a certain place, I'll have somebody put a gun on my head, I'll be afraid to go to that place. It's very natural. But at the same time, if it's my job to go there, I'm forced to go there, I'll have to kind of prepare my mind that, yes, I can die. But at the same time, I'll also have an opportunity to kill the person who might kill me. So it's kind of a kill or be killed. Now, within the situation, the first question arises is that, why? Why would I have to go to that place? Or why would that person who is supposed to kill me have to come to that place also? Now, this is a primary question that Owen asks. Why? Why is there a need for war? And the answer Owen gives through the entire corpus of his poems is there is absolutely no answer. There is absolutely no reason for such a bloody conflict. There is absolutely no reason. It's meaningless. It's futile. It doesn't serve any purpose. And within that scope, death actually becomes meaningless. The significance of death actually within that scope becomes meaningless. It might mean a lot. It has meaning definitely in general philosophical terms. It has meaning for the mother who loses the child or the parents who lose the children. But definitely it is within that ambit for the soldiers or who are there on the front line. It's kill or be killed, and for an absolute futile purpose. And that itself is meaningless. Death within that sphere is also meaningless. The next question is there any major influence of church on the author on the text? I wouldn't say a major influence, but obviously we have religious imagery. We have Christian imagery within the church, within the poem, and definitely we have Christian imagery in many of Owen's poems. Because the Christian imagery, how Owen uses it, the image, the Christian imagery, Owen uses it as a contrariness. He was clearly troubled by the fact that the church was in collusion with the people who were waging the war. The church actually was propagating ideas which are pro-war. I mean, if you have read Look Back in Anger in your previous semesters, you understand Jimmy Porter talks about the same thing when he talks about the local priest who is supporting the government's test of a hydrogen bomb. A church figure who is promoting violence, that is problematic to Wilfred Owen. That is problematic to the poet. And that is why he uses symbols of irony, Christian symbols of irony in an ironical way. Like the cups, the craters, the landmine craters which holds the blood of the soldiers. Now, this again, it's a direct relation to the Christian symbol of the Holy Grail. The Grail actually held the blood of Christ after his crucifixion, the blood which was shed for the salvation of mankind from the original sin. Now, Ironically, this blood is shed not because of salvation. They are also being crucified. He compares the soldiers to crucifixion, to being dying of crucifixion, or they're dying, and their blood is held in cups. But these cups are not the Holy Grail, because this blood is not the blood of salvation. This blood is a blood of meaninglessness. This is how the influence of church, if there is any, I would say comes, or the religious symbolism comes in Wilfred Owen's poem, because it comes through the problematics that he feels, the problem that he feels in the church's collusion with the activities of war. The next question we have is, can we consider Owen to be a pacifist? Yes, absolutely sure. Absolutely. Owen is part of the pacifist group. Yes, he was part of the war. But the way, from where I see it, both Sassoon was a part of war, Owen himself was a part of war. In heart, definitely he was a pacifist. But at the same time, he knew since at that time enlistment was compulsory, and we have to understand during the wars, and a similar thing happened in during the Vietnam War as well. Enlistment in the army was compulsory. I mean, if you're a certain age and if you're male, you have to enlist whether you like it or not. So Owen fighting the war like these children is not a matter of choice, that I want to go and fight for the country. It's mostly he was forced to fight for the country. It might be he was forced to fight for the country. Whether or not we know for sure, yes, previously, before meeting Sassoon, he was not a pacifist. He believed the war to be of a just cause, but definitely after meeting Sassoon and looking through his poems, you can understand his pacifism. You can understand the fact that he was anti-war, definitely. And more than I feel looking at his own biography or looking at his own life, because we have to look at his poems, because for a poet, his poetry is crux of his poetry is his biography. And in his poems, he speaks about the anti-war stance. And yes, definitely, if you ask me, there is, through his poems, if you look into his poems, there is grain of pacifism involved. Any more questions?
I think no more further question.
Okay.
So thank you, Professor Banerjee.
Thank you so much.
And you have talked about Owen's biographical sketch, little cultural history, as well as political history. And I hope our students have understood what are the critical perspective and nuances of this poem. And I'd like to say in this context that our principal sir has already joined us, and I'd like to request him to say a few words and closing this session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sagnik. Really excellent lecture, an interactive and lucid description. Thank you for this extending cooperation towards our student. And thank you, my student, dear student. Once again, I am telling you that we go to the Google Classroom. There will give you some notes, and that will be in your Google Classroom. You may have it from the Google Classroom at any point of time. Also the lectures, all the lectures whose record is given in the classroom. Please go through that. Okay? Thanks once again, Sagnik, for your extended cooperation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I thank you to Professor Bach. Thank you, sir, to you, and thank you to Kekidash College for giving me the opportunity to come here and express my thoughts on this poem. Thank you so much.
This is the concept, so we have to develop this one here.
Sure.
Different teachers from different institutions may meet in at a web space. So this is a new concept. So Sagnik, we will meet you any next question when there will be another series of lecture. Okay.
Sure, sir. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, anyways, it is a.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So now we are closing this session. Thank you all.